So, good evening, everybody, all around the world. We have visitors from the States, France, Europe, and Israel. I'm very excited to open this Writing the Unwritable conference, which is co-hosted by Professor Judy Baumel-Schwartz and myself. And before we actually start the conference, I'd like to start with the director of Bar-Ilan University, Professor Amnon Albeck. So please, over to you.
Okay, good evening, everyone. You should definitely keep muted, but as an experienced teacher, it's terrible to talk to black squares, so stay with your cameras on. It's much. I'm very happy to open this meeting, which, if I understood correctly, was supposed to be physically conducted here at Bar-Ilan. So Zoom is better than nothing. We just read the last Shabbat portion of the week, Parashat Bo. We just read about the first instruction or mitzvah to memorize, to remember the Exodus and its background. And I think it's within the DNA of the Jewish people to remember and to carry the history and remembering of the history from generation to generation. So it's very appropriate to us to deal with this issue of Holocaust memorial and how we transfer the memory from generation to generation, because Holocaust survivors are disappearing slowly, and even the second generation becomes older. So we should try to be active in carrying out this message, this information, this memory, this what we have to take from it. And it's not only for historians and social workers that are present here or organize this meeting, it's for historians, for philosophers, for educators, sociologists, people from the world of arts, literature. It belongs to everyone. So we have the leaders to study how to transform it, how to transfer it, but it belongs to everyone. And also when we talk, we discuss who is our target population. So of course, the Jewish people, the Israelis, but not only, it's the European nations, European people, it's our Arab neighbors, it's for everyone who cares about human rights and humanity and normal life on earth. So this is I think, a major task, how to transform it into a post-memorial concept. And I really hope that this conference will be only the beginning of studies and activities to really being able to carry on this message of Holocaust post-memorial. So I wish you a very fruitful short conference, and I'll be happy to hear about the following steps that come out of it. So have a very interesting evening and very fruitful evening.
Thank you very, very much, Professor Albeck. It's a pleasure and inspiration to hear your greeting. I think the memory is for all of us to remember. And I'd like to start the conference proceedings with a short history of how this conference was conceived. As I mentioned earlier, the idea was conceived mutually by Professor Judy Baumel-Schwartz and myself more than a year ago, when we had this idea of having a 2-day conference with guests from all over the world. We got a conference hall together, we got the dates, we got even a photographer to come and video the conference. And then COVID-19 erupted and everything changed. Our lives changed upside down. We're still under the assault, you could say, of COVID-19. But with consulting with Judy, we decided to carry on, not give up, and hold this mini brief conference where people get a chance to present their ideas. Hopefully, as Professor Albeck said, we will meet again and have a fuller conference. So this conference is held, it's hosted by several bodies, the School of Social Work at Bar-Ilan University and the School of Social Work at the University of Haifa, and the Institute of Holocaust Studies at Bar-Ilan University. In the previous round, Amcha was also part of the idea, as well as the Steinmetz-Herkovich Family Fund. And thank you, Martin, for giving us that support. So I'd like to thank Professor Nechami Baum, Professor Miri Cohen, and Dr. Martin Auerbach for helping us to think about this. I'd like also to help to thank the scientific committee that was supporting of the whole project, Professor Laro Hobson-Faur, Tina Grossman, Professor Anat Freund, and Dr. Itzik Pass, who helped me to coordinate the conference. Before I pass on to the first panel, I'd like to say a few words about my own personal journey of post-memory, which perhaps will explain how this came to be. Ever since I remember myself, I had this sense that there was a presence in my life which was not related to my own sensual experience. Eva Hoffman, as we all know, is a Polish-Jewish writer, and she wrote that the shadows of the survivors of the Holocaust continue to haunt the future generations. Even though these future generations are far removed from the actual experiences of World War II, the stories told and the stories avoided continue to have a deep impact upon the psyches of the children and the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren. They are passed on through unconscious processes, uncanny in nature, creating psychic implants in the soul of the children and grandchildren, where they continue to exert a heavy burden. So I've always felt that the near annihilation of the Jewish community in Europe and elsewhere was affecting me as if I was there myself. As I was born 20 years after, that made me worry. I was examining my life circumstances as part of my training practice as being a psychoanalytic psychotherapist. I haven't found anything that can explain my deep preoccupation with the Holocaust. It was only later, through therapy, that I've realized that the stories of the Holocaust that I'd been exposed to since I was a child from my grandparents have moved me to be and act in ways it has taken me many years to make sense of. I found out that I was not only making life choices based upon my own deliberations and options, but also based upon deeper layers I was not aware of. It was as if I was obeying an inner dictum I could not comprehend, let alone control. So it was my psychoanalytic training and practice that led me to think about the mental emotional mechanism that has facilitated these processes. That mechanism is called, in short, repetition compulsion, which encompasses a wide array of mental and emotional processes. It is through those insights that I've come to understand that what I thought of as haunting, traumatic memories are indeed traces of post-memory. That is, vivid experiences and memories of events which clearly did not happen to me, but affected me as if they did. The story of post-memory inevitably carries the faults of a story told from a distance, and yet it is the only possible way left for my generation to tell this story. In an essay about Claude Lanzmann's Shoah, Shoshana Feldman wrote that being a witness is about taking responsibility of what really happened. It is about obeying the legal pledge and the imperative of the oath the witness takes. It is akin to testifying before both the court of history and of the law, in front of audience of readers or fellow human beings. It is not just a reporting of the facts, recorded or remembered. It is an act of conjuring memory so as to present another human being and a community. Giving testimony is a moral commitment to carry on narrating history beyond its personal dimensions. The role of a testimony bearer, as we all are, I believe, in this room, is not one carried with ease. It is a burden, but also, I'd like to suggest, as a privilege. It is a burden due to the necessity of carrying it. It is a privilege as it positions the narrator along a long familiar line, thus renewing and perhaps even somewhat healing a sense of continuity severed by the Holocaust. It is a possible way of combating the oblivion or forgetfulness. It is a process whereby the burden of the transmission of traumatic memory does not turn into a haunting and crippling memory, but lends itself to post-memorial work. Stephen Foch wrote in 2019 that in our times, the future has collapsed. We are overwhelmed by what we have to witness. This is what haunts second and third generations, the ongoing transmission not of the experiences themselves, but the dark shadows. It is an uncanny experience, both alien and deeply familiar, lying deep in the unconscious. Struggling with these shadows can be as daunting as the concrete realities that have cast them. While Frosch and others like Hoffman and Hirsch wrote about the transmission of memories of Holocaust survivors to the second generation, I suggest that within that term, it is necessary to include future generations as well, upon whom those experiences which have not been experienced continue to exert a meaningful and even fateful impact. A certain guilt is inherent in such a claim, as it is clear that the lives and well-being of future generations are not under the immediate threat of the events of World War II. Yet their shadows certainly create the sensation that those events are not in fact over and are present, like a bad dream, which continues to distress the dreamer long after he had been awoken from the dream. Some of that is normally explained by the fact that caretakers transmit to their offsprings unprocessed areas of their experience and create a parental environment which is shaped by their own experience. But somehow, in an uncanny way, and yet open to psychoanalytic suggestions, the impact of those events upon those who were born after their occurrence continue to exert an influence. It is possible to try and deny the impact and suppress its poisonous expressions, or try and deal with it through interpretation and creativity. The former option can lead to pathological individual and social consequences, while the latter can help to stop the compulsive repetition and become post-memorial work. And at this stage, I'd like to share with you some images of the work that I personally have been engaged with over the last couple of years. I've been engaged in processing the work of letters. Just a second. Just sharing the screen. This is a book that due out in June this year, based upon an investigation I've made of letters found by relatives of mine in France, telling the story of my maternal mother's relatives who have all died in Auschwitz. Some parts of the family, some members of the family were in France, Paris, and some were in Salonika. I've survived because my grandmother emigrated to Israel well in time. This is Leon Cohen and his family, who's the main protagonist of the story, upon whom I've had a fixated post-memory, if you like. And it is the story of these letters, postcards, photographs that I've made an analysis of these 9 brothers and sisters, of which only one survived, my grandmother. And the book will come out in June, as I said. And in writing the book and preparing for this conference, I've come up with this definition of what I think is post-memory. And I present to you this definition, which is based upon an interpretation of what Frosch, Hirsch, and Hoffman have suggested to us. And I'd like to end my talk with that and carry on and continue with our first panel. I don't know if Atina is with us. Atina apologizes for not being able to host the first panel as she's engaged with happy family events. So I'll take over. I hope that Atina will join us and contribute. So I'd like to present the first speaker of the first panel. And just before I do that, I remind you again that all the abstracts and bios of the speakers in the conference have been uploaded to a post, which you've all received a link to. So you feel welcome to refer that through the talk. Questions, if you have questions or comments, please reserve them to the end of the conference. You can either write them in a chat and we'll look at them towards the end of the conference, or you can ask them yourselves when we finish the two panels. So with that, I pass on to the first panel, which is titled Trauma in History, Psychology in Memory. And I'd like to introduce Dr. Bella Sagi, who's a bibliotherapist. I'll introduce each speaker in short. You can read of all their work in the post. So Bella Sagi is a bibliotherapist. She lectures at David Yalin Academic College. She did a PhD in gender studies at Bar-Ilan University. And over to you, Bella.
Thank you. It was very interesting to hear you, Rony. Thank you. Good evening. I'm very happy and excited to be here with you and to share briefly my latest study, which focuses on creating memory project and the role of bibliotherapy in answering the questions we're dealing with at this conference, Writing the Unwritable. For many years, Holocaust survivors and their testimonies constituted a main research focus regarding the Holocaust and its nationwide memory. Borat and Santner say that the testimonies were aimed at structuring history and memory via personal narratives that come together to form a national narrative, that of Holocaust and revival, Shoah v'Tkuma, forming a distance from the real pain of trauma. This narrative served as a dissociative defense mechanism against direct contact with the trauma, but at the cost of disconnection, of replacing processing of the mourning with fixation on a single story, and ultimately creating a pathological process that in Freud's words can be termed melancholia. In this way, we leave a legacy to the second, third, and soon fourth generation of dissociation regarding the Holocaust as a collective historical event, as well as its consequences of emotional disconnection and estrangement. The challenge that confronts us at present is to enable the processing of mourning that has become fixed in place to give renewed life to a calcified narrative and to offer an alternative to the familiar narrative that has become sanctified. The question at present is how to transform the story of the survivors from something that happened over there, in the words of Momik David Grossman's protagonist in Sea Under Love, Be'eretz Sham, to the here and now, with no intergenerational transference of the trauma. Creating Memory venture was founded by Mr. Martin Ashkovitz and Ms. Afat Bigman 2 years ago. They formed a program for young adults using bibliotherapy and creative writing in an attempt to transform the there and then into here and now. The purpose of the study was to look at the writing processes and products of this program, which were published in the booklet Creating Memory. I have it here, hope you can see. And as to conclude what can be learned about the role of these and similar programs regarding the possibility to form personal living and changing narrative of the Holocaust, and thus to advance the processing of trauma that is vital for our existence and for our future. When analyzing the text, mostly poems, using narrative qualitative method, I found three leading themes relating to issues of identity and memory, proximity, and distance. I will now give an example of each of the themes and conclude in some hope for the future. The first one is entanglement. The writers, young people in their 20s, deal with their connection to the Holocaust. Some are themselves third-generation survivors, and some have a nation-based connection, although the Holocaust is clearly part of their identity. One of the participants describes an experience of becoming entangled in memories and writes in the first person. I remember when I was in the Holocaust. The same feelings arise in me, longing in memories that were never mine. She describes the contact with these memories as a contact devoid of defenses. She's willing to become entangled with these memories and to let them exist within her as part of herself and of her inner emotional world. This contact with no limits of the self, with no defenses, seems dangerous, much like the pathological family patterns called enmeshment trauma. On the other hand, we can find disconnection. I found distance and a sense of estrangement versus the national symbols of the Holocaust. The writers describe the sense of resistance when they are required to be with the memory of the Holocaust now because it's the Memorial Day, now because it's a ceremony, because the siren one writes. Come on, think, sad thoughts. Think about Grandpa David and Grandma Henya. How we saved her, how they were heroes, about Schindler's List, the boy in the strip pajamas, the pianist, about where was God. The writers, notably with courageous honesty, demonstrate the struggle of third generation to feel something in connection with the national symbolism of Memorial Day for Holocaust and bravery. The third theme I called A Child Peers Through the Keyhole. It's a quote from one of the texts. This is connection through the gaze, through the lens. As I see it, this theme represents the possibility suggested by creating memory program, which is that of observation. However, observation of memories that are not my own or of silent stories is not simple and risk-free observation. So most of the writers describe it as an opportunity to take a peek, a quick glance, and perhaps the glance will arouse the libido and lead to creative work. One of the writers describes her attempt to situate herself versus the memories of the Holocaust, whether entering the castle of grief or remaining outside. She writes, sleeping between fence and alley, standing and peeking into windows. She tries to find her way in this symbolic world of Holocaust memories and finds the solution of the short gaze. She remains outside, facing the castle, gathering memories, but she feels. She writes, and I heard and I smelled horror. The place of separateness is reached through the capacity to move between different witnessing options, between memory modes, in the words of Dr. Dan Amiel. The observation facilitates creative processes and growth. Freud describes melancholia as an open wound, the libido retreating from the lost object into the self. This is a constant shadow of the loss, and the search for it becomes an intergenerational search, like Rony said before. In a text entitled Memorial Candle, another participant writes, a child peers through the keyhole, observes the bent back of another child with an aching body, reconstructing his father's Hanukkah. Unfortunately, we do not have time tonight to give more examples and addressing the fascinating issue of images and metaphors, but I would like to summarize by saying that the solution offered by the project participants is a solution of movement and creation. It is a poetic but also mental solution, which dissolves the frozen traumatic lacuna and allows living water to flow. Through the creative and bibliotherapeutic process, they are transferred from silent witnesses of a single, untouchable, unwritable story into active creators who can, through writing, touch these memories, not their own, pick at these stories, also not their own, hold them in their hand as a clod of cold earth, crumble and resuscitate it. In this way, oxygen enters the frozen areas, movement begins, recovery begins. This is what Yehuda Amichai refers to in his poem, The Place Where We Are Right. And I will end with his words that summarize the finding of the conclusion clearly. Doubts and loves dig up the world like a mole, a plow, and a whisper will be heard in the place where the ruined house once stood. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bella, for this moving and enlightening presentation of the work you do with Marty.
Thank you.
Now move on to the second speaker, Professor Lara Hobson-Farr.
Okay.
I'd like just to introduce you, if I may. She's now a professor of modern Jewish history at the Sorbonne in Paris. Her research, she's written so much and published so much. I'll just introduce you to one detail. Her research focuses on the intersection between French and American Jewish life during the Holocaust. So it's with great pleasure that I welcome you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I promise not to say thank you, but I can't resist. So I will start with an anecdote from a conversation that many of us have had over the past 9 months. Expressing my guilt for being unable to go home, my mom showed newfound stoicism. It's completely okay, she told me. The war lasted 5 years. This is 1 year. I can handle it. Such a statement implies a resilience gained from lived experience during the Holocaust. Yet my mom was born in Detroit in 1946. It feels self-indulgent to share this story. American Jews were the lucky ones. To claim shared memory or a visceral connection with Holocaust survival smacks of appropriation, even if we're also told, and there's a very strong narrative, that we are the same people. Historian Peter Novick rightfully questions the nature of the American Jewish relationship to the Holocaust. Historian Laura Levitt, however, takes an altogether different path in American Jewish losses after the Holocaust, suggesting that there is an interplay between the ordinary losses of Jewish Americans and the extraordinary losses of the Holocaust. In this context, the post-memory of my family's experiences during World War I and its violent aftermath take on distinct emotional meanings and certainly fuse in certain places with Holocaust narratives. My mother's mother, my grandma Lottie, came to the United States in 1928 as a young teen. Her town of origin, Tel Echan, was located not far from Pinsk and unfortunately was also on the front of World War I. The family had to flee soon after her birth in 1915. I know little of her life before she obtained, with her father and some of her sisters, a coveted visa to the United States. I know that at some point they were in Kiev, and this may be the place where her own mother, Miriam, died of typhus. The family was most likely still in Kiev during the pogroms of 1917 to 1920. When her father was lined up to be shot in a firing squad, my young grandma was sent to beg for mercy and was kicked across a courtyard. The oldest daughter of the family, my Aunt Ray, a beauty, replaced her and succeeded in freeing the men. According to this family story, Ray was covered with gifts, fur coats, and many newborn girls were thereafter named Rachel in her honor. As a historian, I am convinced that family stories are glass beads. I do not have many of them, and they can be easily crushed by too much scrutiny. If I deconstruct them by trying to anchor them in space and time, I might have only dust. This intangible post-memory, so beautifully theorized by Marian Hirsch and embodied in the image of my great-grandmother Miriam in the only picture we have of her, created a very real space for imagining and remembering, but especially transmission within my family. While quiet on her own past, my grandma filled daily life with injunctions for the future, expressing an unarticulated fear of premature separation. kiss on the cheek, never on the lips. My mother, without missing a beat, continues to explain the proper way to open a jar. In contrast to my grandma's silence on the past, my mom shares the family stories with great relish, acting as a memorial candle, to use Dina Vardy's concept. Yet if Vardy suggests that parents choose one child in particular to act as memorial candle, I might add that the child too also chooses to untangle one ancestor's story in particular. Like most American Jews, I also have a Hebrew name. Mine is Bati Rachel, named after Basha Liba, the aunt in Detroit who probably made the visas happen. And of course, Aunt Ray, the heroine of the pogrom story. An invitation thus to untangle the story that I probably deflect onto others' intimate stories. The transmitted experience of ordinary loss has certainly forged my listening space for narratives of the Holocaust. I embrace the method of oral history, replacing my silent grandma with grandparents who are willing to share the past. Yet this personal approach to history raises a distinct set of ethical questions. One of the most central questions is the question of names. Most of the individuals I interviewed for my second book, called Becoming Refugee, which is on the migrations of children between the 1938 to 42 period, granted me the right to use their real names and even insisted on this. Yet as I developed my analysis, I sensed it would become a problem. By historicizing the narratives and revealing their inherent contradictions, I was essentially crushing their glass beads. Anthropologists grapple with restitution. Historians rarely do so. I decided to take the risk of showing my manuscript to several individuals in my study. I was not surprised to find that my research at times led to the destruction of previous narratives, yet sometimes to the creation of new ones. For one article on the relationship between two sisters, I instinctively changed their names before showing it to them, then waited with trepidation for their reaction. I was surprised that there were even very minor changes, and they insisted that I replace their false names with their real names. I did so, resubmitted the article, only to receive the ominous email, "Laura, we have a problem." A second interviewee shared her ambiguous tale of family solidarity. Her French relative had a passport that would have allowed her to smuggle 4 children out of Germany. The relative refused to take 4, but did take 2. In Paris, the sisters were separated, the younger ones sent to even more distant relatives who left her in a park during the day while they worked. Reading my text, she had second thoughts on sharing the story. "This is not the legacy I want to pass on. I don't want anyone to look like I'm complaining. I don't want to look like I'm complaining," she told me. Finally, Ernst Walfer, who remains, after reading my manuscript, committed to my use of his real name, described his departure from Frankfurt for France on a Kindertransport in 1939. Ernst had had his bar mitzvah, yet the family was not Orthodox. Still, before leaving, 14-year-old Ernst received a gift from his mother, a talit katan, a prayer shawl to wear daily. She said, "The Orthodox have taken you out, you stay with them, and you do what they do." So for all my time in Paris, I was Orthodox. Ernst initially passed, and then eventually became a practicing Jew in France. Religious children were cared for by the Austrian pedagogue Ernst Papanek in a home run by the Jewish organization Oze. Ernst's response to my manuscript was altogether surprising. He wrote to me, "I shivered to read that had my mother not impressed on me to stay with the Orthodox group from Frankfurt, I would have never met Ernst Papanek and probably would not have ended up on the transport from France to the United States in May 1941. Survivors like Ernst Walfer took my work in stride. My historical narrative allowed him to find new meaning in his mother's injunction to stay among the Orthodox. This put him into contact with Ernst Papanek, who remained a father figure to him long after he learned of his parents' murder. It also provides a means for understanding why he was selected for the life-saving transport from France to the United States. Ernst found a way for his mother to save his life. Narratives of post-memory and memory, of lived and non-lived experiences, resist logic, yet forge for some a listening space or resilience. An argument for leaving some intact, untouched by the quill of the historian.
Thank you very, very much, Laura, for this very, very personal story, which you've managed to make into such a wonderful form of research. Thank you. We now move on to Holly Levitsky. She holds degrees in English language and literature. She's from the University of Michigan. She works primarily in the areas of Jewish American literature, Holocaust studies, and exile studies. She's published many books, many articles, books, chapters on the subject. So I welcome Holly.
Thank you, Rony. In 2001, I took a year-long post at Warsaw University as a Fulbright Distinguished Chair in American Literature. I offered the Polish University's first ever course on the Holocaust. I learned quickly that it was unlikely my students there had ever met a Jew before me. They knew little about Jewish history, including Polish Jewish history. I thus faced the task of teaching Polish students about their own history. It became clear that while I was prepared to teach the Holocaust they were expecting me to teach was not my Holocaust. I chose to begin my a course that I titled America in the Holocaust with Art Spiegelman's Mouse, which had been the recent subject in Poland of national debates questioning the role of Poles during the Holocaust. During our lively class discussions, I was sympathetic to student concerns about the depiction of Poles as bad pigs, which was what was really at the center of their national debates. And they in turn became more intrigued by their nation's Polish Jewish history. Their misinformation about Polish Jewish history and Holocaust history in general gave me a door into their reality. So in our first informal discussions about their nation's history, I asked students to share family stories, and what came out immediately were, on their own terms, heroic relatives and tragic circumstances. This included grandparents fighting Nazis in the Warsaw Uprising or with the Home Army, and relatives sent away as slave laborers. Almost every student, in fact, shared that someone in their family had saved or helped a Jew or a Jewish family, though no one could actually cite the name of a saved Jew or Jewish family. But since the graphic novel began in a pre-war Polish world where non-Jews and Jews lived parallel and sometimes assimilated lives, Mouse became a helpful classroom illustration of the competing narratives of non-Jewish and Jewish Poles. What I mean is, Mouse showed not just the stratification of pre-war life in Poland, but the ramifications of being a Jew or a Gentile in those circumstances. And this was important for our classroom work. For Spiegelman, Mouse was a way to tell a family story. So I turned to that shape for our course project. And I asked students for their course project to interview and then creatively tell the story of a family member who was alive during World War II. So just to remind you, this was 2001, 2002. So quite a few years ago and just after 9/11. Specifically in this project, they had to ask this relative what they remembered about Jews from before and during the war and include that into the project. So the submitted projects were incredibly imaginative. Polish people are very artistic, and my students had learned so many different skills and arts and crafts. And so these stories took the form of just very tangible things: scrapbooks, storybooks, diaries, visual narratives, three-dimensional structures, and more. And they used, to outline the stories, they used musical scores for one grandmother who was a musician, paper aging processes, linen, twine, paper mache, various printing techniques. They clearly took a lot of care in this project. More importantly, though, students made surprising discoveries that really burst asunder many of the platitudes they'd shared in our informal class discussions about their families. So I'm going to share two examples quickly. The first example, which was titled Interview with My Father, and it was printed as a book. Anna, I think I had 6 Annas in this class, so Anna interviewed her father, who, a man who loved history, and as she was growing up had always quizzed her on facts and dates from Polish history. So he tells Anna he doesn't know any Jews, but he heard a lot about Jews from her grandfather, who was a shoemaker. And he quotes his father, her grandfather. He would say, they were cunning as foxes and joined their forces to make Polish sellers bankrupt. They took us for enemies, and in consequence, we considered them as such. What really makes me angry, this is the grandfather still, what really makes me angry is that they always called themselves Polish Jews. They separated themselves from the society. And then her father says, your grandfather strongly disliked them. He often told Jewish jokes and he laughed at them. Her father continues to deny remembering any Jews specifically, but adds that, quote, Jews were always villains, and their very presence caused a stir that he said often led to war. So sadly, in the book, she neither reflects on this deeper historical anti-Semitism suggested by her grandfather's hateful words, and she doesn't call out her father's anti-Semitic views, but we talked about it in class. In the second illustration, Pavel, he put it together as a leather-bound, kind of a leather-bound diary. Pavel wrote, and he titled it Fragments of My Grandfather's War. He wrote about his grandfather. He interviewed his grandfather, a carpenter who fought in the Home Army. And he relates the respect received by Polish officers in the POW camps by the Germans. He said the Poles received so many packages from international organizations that the Germans bought bread from them. And they were encouraged to sing the Polish national anthem and other Polish songs. And he just records this as the interview continues. And then he adds his own commentary, Pavel does, the student. He says, well, after hearing this story, I remembered rumors of Jewish ancestry in my family, which had long been circulating. And Pavel tries to get his grandfather to verify what he calls the innuendo that his grandmother was Jewish by descent. He has very sound suspicions, but his grandfather denies it and denies it. Pavel writes that my grandmother's physical type was rather distinctive, but both my grandparents denied it, and my grandfather said again, no, she was not a Jew. Pavel describes the source of this denial or repression from his family as emerging from an incident he learns from his grandfather. So his grandmother was in Ravensbrück, forced labor camp as a Pole, and she had gotten a very easy post, I guess, in the kitchen, I think. And a coworker who wanted her job reported her to the commander as a Jew. And nobody knows the conclusion to the story. That's all he hears from the grandfather. But Pavel concludes that she managed to clear herself. Obviously, if she did not, she probably would have been executed right on the spot, or at best deported to a death camp. This, as well as the post-war persecution of Jews, would probably be more than enough to conceal her racial identity for her whole life. This is Pavel reflecting on this. So after reading all of these 30 or so stories, scrapbooks, et cetera, and seeing the lack of, the lack of awareness students had, for me, it was, for instance, when the 2018 Polish legislation passed, that would essentially criminalize any mention of Polish complicity in the Holocaust, the heated global controversy really came home to me from this experience I had with Polish students. How differently Poles Jewish Poles and non-Jewish Poles perceive their entire history still is really something that we need to confront in post-memory. Because while I found the misinformation and the anti-Semitism unsettling, it wasn't surprising. And in my research, I've looked at textbooks over several decades in Poland. And unfortunately, contemporary primary, secondary, university textbooks don't make clear why Jews who lived in a country for over 1,000 years suddenly disappeared. So they're simply not being taught. And what I had to do was then go in and teach Polish Jewish history. So my class learned that Jews were one of several minorities that lived in Poland for centuries, that they had engaged each other, Jews and non-Jews in Poland for all that time in regular, even daily, neighborly, social, commercial, and other kinds of interactions before World War II. And finally, I could help them conclude that during the Holocaust, many of these Poles did act heroically toward their Jewish neighbors. But nonetheless, it was a different narrative. So discussing scenes from Maus in class, my students identified with the helpful Poles in the book, like Pani Matinova, who offered Wladek and Anya safety for a time in her cellar, as long as her husband didn't know. Seeing their behavior, the Poles saw this behavior as a sign of continued Polish goodwill toward their Jewish neighbors. And one student verbalized in class what I sensed was a commonly held sentiment. In Maus, the fact that no Jews would have survived without help from Poles is never brought out. So I continued to the last day with them to make them aware that when the laws changed under occupation and being Jewish becomes criminalized, basically, and by this new definition could be neither law-abiding nor citizens of that state, Polish citizens could keep their Polish identity. They could walk on streets, shop in stores, eat at restaurants, live in their own homes. They could help their neighbors or not, but Jews had no such choices. By laws, directives, and resolutions, Jews were required to gather and be removed when called. The machinery of a final solution in place. Life was uncertain for Poles. I conceded this to my students, and it was certainly difficult, and their stories show that. But Poles were not presented with the same final terms as the Jews. And this is where the perspective and the narrative sharply diverge. Productively working through Maus in memory in the Polish classroom really brought me closer to an understanding of the nature of conflicting Holocaust narratives of Polish Jews and non-Jews. Michael Rothberg conceives a space where such conflicting narratives confront one another, potentially, though not necessarily, creating sympathy between groups, suggesting that memory works productively through negotiation, cross-referencing, and borrowing. The result of memory conflict is not less memory, but more, even of subordinated memory traditions. But my question remained, and that is it possible to work through these conflicting historical memories of the Holocaust without endorsing historically inaccurate narratives? The literature classroom for me opened up a space where the tragic separateness of experience could be at least identified, creating a common goal to understand the other's experience. The work produced more memory in everyone. And in that, I think, succeeded in moving us forward. Using Maus to teach Polish students the history of Jews in Poland was an opportunity to use creative literature, my field, as a practice much closer to the truth. The experience itself opened my mind and my heart to the personal stories of individual Poles, just as my stories opened their minds to questions they had not known to ask. That does not exempt moral failure, nor does it place blame on future generations. It asks that as teachers we strive to become cultural diplomats, seeking out partners within our shared text to create interculturally competent citizens of the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Oli, for this really moving witnessing piece of work you've done, bring that story into the Polish schoolroom. Very much. We move on to Yael Shalom-Zedak, who's a PhD candidate in psychoanalysis and hermeneutics, Bar-Ilan University. She also works at AMCHA, which, for those of you who are unaware, is an Israeli organization that was set up to give counseling and support for Holocaust survivors and their families. So, Yael.
Hi, everyone. The name of my lecture is Between Language and Silence. In his book, Beyond Guilt and Atonement, Jean-Marie writes, those who were tortured will never feel at home in the world. Faith in the world will never return. For Amiri, his inability to feel at home in a world betrayed him permits his use of language as well. While in the concentration camp, he tries to find some comfort in the last lines of a poem he loved, but nothing. I was listening to the sounds of the words, he writes. Try to feel the rhythm, the spiritual configuration, nothing. The poem no longer went beyond reality. It just stood there, and the capo yelling left, and the soup is thin. But the collapse of the confronting effect of language in face of trauma is not limited to poetry. The traumatic event also collapses the ability of language to describe feelings and emotions, as Emery writes. The pain was what it was. Beyond that, there's nothing to say. Further to these words of Emery, you can say that there is a double, even triple collapse of the language. The collapse of the poetic language and also the collapse of the emotional language. But these two forms of language also drag with them the day-to-day language that loses its connection to reality. We left the camp, Amari continues, naked, contemptible, emptied, confused. And a long time passed until we relearned even the mere everyday language of freedom. End of quote. One can say, therefore, that when man is deprived of his basic freedom, not only his faith in the world fails, but also fails his faith in the language that's supposed to represent that world. The word, milah, dies in every place in which reality demands absolute rule, Amiri concludes. For us, it died long ago, and we are left not even with the feeling that we should be sorry over its fading. The betrayal of words in face of trauma can explain part of the silence of the Holocaust survivors. In this context, Amir Gutfreund writes in his book, Our Holocaust. At home, life was ordinary, but under the surface, an enchanted tapestry of forbidden and allowed. The questions you don't ask mom, the questions you don't ask dad, and the questions you ask and there are no answers. Where are you, mom, in the world? Like dad in the ghetto? How did you walk barefoot in the snow? Mom, why do you hate ants? You don't ask. The constant hesitation between silence and speech, between the imperative live to tell and the inability to do so, positions us, therapists, in a state of confusion. What to ask, when to be silent, what to bury, what to revive, what serves life and what serves death. This confusion increases given the inability to know. Is the difficulty to utter the trauma rooted in choice or coercion, in repression or concealment, in a lack of words or lack of sufficient words? But whether it is untellable, unsayable, unspeakable, or unhearable, the connection between trauma and language as against the rights is always the negative "and," whether willingly or unwillingly. Given this confusion in the intersection between words and trauma, I would like to suggest that the mental truth is not in words, not silence, but rather in between them, as Feldman and Lab describe in the book Testimony. As one who is caught simultaneously between two contradictory desires to speak and not to speak, I'm left only with the option to stutter. Of this mental stuttering, as if unable to decide whether to speak or remain silent, Yael Naaman writes in a book, Hayo Hayta. Pazit, the heroine of the story, as only child of Holocaust survivor, is portrayed as a woman full of contradiction. On the one hand, lonely, wishes to die. On the other hand, thinks about the future and wishes to be loved. Pazit's two-way mental movement is also reflected through the way she uses language. That is why, quote, she erased from her books all the notes she had written in them, went over them on both sides of the page so that you couldn't see anything, not even against the light, Naaman described. As opposed to the erasure movement, Pazit didn't stop writing. She would write on everything, on the packs of Nelson she smoked, and she always struggled to recount exactly where she wrote what, because all the cigarette packs looked alike. The writing on the untraceable cigarette packs reflects the conflicting movement in Pazit's psyche. On the one hand, she doesn't stop writing. On the other hand, she cannot or doesn't wish to find what she has written. But for Pazit, writing was not only a means of expression or consolation, but also a way to calm herself. She would sit until 2 in the morning and for hours simply copy from an encyclopedia. It would calm her. The copying of words from encyclopedia entries, which was done after psychiatric hospitalizations, shows Pazit concrete metonymic use of words. It shows her ability to separate the language from its symbolic and metaphorical meaning and turn it into pill, consumed in time of distress. The writing offset by erasure demonstrates Pazit's ambivalent position toward language, a constant quivering between life and death, between sanity and insanity, between writing and erasing, between presence and absence, reflects how the psyche is facing the trauma, a trauma which cannot be spoken about, but also cannot remain silent. The refusal to choose a side, to become fixed in a safe place that feels like home, reflects what the Holocaust took from the survivors and their children. In this sense, the stable stance in face of the world that betrayed them and their silent promise to their self and to the world that they will never, ever feel at home in it, explains their dual attitude towards language. Language that enables the voice to be heard, but which directs towards a world that refused to listen. And we, as therapists who treat survivors and their children, who understand the stuttering, who witness to the writing that becomes erasing, to a poem that is crushing to reality, we will not join in the stuttering that annihilates the soul. We'll face it with an apprehensive yet stable voice. We will pick a side. We will choose life. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yael, for this moving story and the work you're doing. Before we move on, I'd like to remind the speakers that we are trying to keep to a 7-minute time limit. We're running a bit late, so I apologize to all. I find it impossible to interrupt anyone in mid-speech as these stories are so moving. But let's see if we can keep to that time boundary. I'd like to introduce next speaker, Adelaide Schmitz from Düsseldorf. She's been studying social pedagogy since 1987. She's a co-founder of a unit to research right-wing extremism, founded in 1987, and establishes a research focus at the University of Applied Sciences. So, Adelaide, the microphone is yours. There you go.
Yes, I'm greeting you from Düsseldorf. It's the partner town from Haifa. And what you see is Erinnerungsort Alte Schlachthof, Memorial and Information Center of the campus of our Hochschule Düsseldorf, University of Applied Science. Since 2016, our University of Applied Sciences is situated on a historic site, the former municipal abattoir of the city of Düsseldorf. During the Nazi rule, the abattoir became a crime scene. This brings with it responsibility to inform about this history and to reflect it. And of course, it is an important place for commemoration. On campus, we have a big challenge. I will inform you a little bit about the historical side and the challenges, about the memorial, the exhibition, the research and documentation, and a bit about the...
Adelaide, sorry for interrupting you, but is it only here that the presentation is flashing? You'll see. Well, on my screen, it flashes. It doesn't stay stable. Is it just me or everybody?
No, it's okay.
Okay, so sorry, continue.
It's okay.
Is it okay for you? Otherwise, I don't mute it.
No, it's fine. No, it's
okay.
fine.
It's okay in New York.
Okay, thank you very much. You give me a sign if something is not working.
Yes, it's fine.
And I want to tell you something about the history of this abattoir. The abattoir, in former time, it was set into operation in 1899. I have an old picture here from 1930. During World War II, it became a part of the Shoah. Almost 6,000 Jewish men, women, and children from Düsseldorf administrative district were assembled in the large cattle market hall. They were registered, robbed, and forced to spend the whole night in the cold and wet hall. The next morning, they were deported from the nearby freight station to ghettos in occupied Eastern Europe. From 1941 till 1944, overall 7 transports were organized. We estimate that only 300 people survived. We don't know it exactly. After the war, the abattoir was still used until 2002. Nothing remembered what happened there. Afterwards, the building stayed unused and exposed to decay. You see the hall again? It's a picture from 2011 and another picture from the building of the old cattle hall. Only the large cattle market hall and another building remained. 2016, the campus of Hochschule Düsseldorf has been situated on this terrain and there were constructed new buildings. The historical buildings are integrated into a brand new campus. The challenge was to integrate the historic abattoir buildings, not only to adapt to university needs, but also finally honor the memory of those who have suffered there. Since 5 years, the university library and the campus IT are placed in the restored and converted large livestock hall. In the entrance area, you see the windows, you can see a little bit the portraits. We have the memorial center. It's not a big place. The whole hall is used by the library and the campus IT. And you see in the entrance, we have organized exhibition where we show the portraits and also gave the information about the biographies of the families who had been collected in this hall. A permanent exhibition portrays people whose lives and family stories are linked to this place. The authentic ramp leads to the basement. Cattle used to be driven down the ramp, but also the Jewish people were forced to take these steps. The Memorial Center Alter Schlachthof invites all the members of Hochschule Düsseldorf and visitors to remember the crimes committed there during World War II and to remember the people. As there is not much place, we present the results of our research work on the crimes, the biographies and documents in the digital archive in the basement. On the left side, you see the touch screens realized by students from the Faculty of Media. Visitors can research by their own also in this room. You see, there is a group from Israel, tourist guides who came from Israel to visit this place. The archive is being continuously expanded and aims to gradually give face and names to all the victims. We are in contact with some of the last survivors and their families who share with us family stories and documents. And many of our visitors come from other countries, from Israel too. You can see it in our guest book. I don't know if you can read it. There are some comments in it. The memorial on our campus is a challenge and a chance. Our historical and political education program with guided tours, informative events, workshops, readings, and lectures complete the exhibition. The memorial is not only meant to be a reminder for past crimes, but also strives to educate on the after effects of the Nazi rule in society today. After all, many of the social phenomena and negative dispositions until today are like racism, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, or denial of the Holocaust. With this memorial on the campus, we are always looking to find new and creative methods of historical and political learning and education for students, pupils, and interested people. From some of our creative projects, I would like to briefly present only one from last year. I'm not sure if it is possible, or have I time?
Hardly.
Hardly.
No time.
No time, okay. It was a digital theater performance, and it was the possibility in June 2020. Over 100 spectators from all over Germany, France, and Israel went to a digital theater journey into the past and back into the present. It was part of a theater performance with the title Carousel of the Remembrance. The central message was, the central question was, what message do the survivors leave us for today? We wanted to connect the historical place with central questions of remembrance and responsibility today. Doing memory with the methods of theater was very challenging, especially in times in COVID. Therefore, we developed the digital version of the former live theater performance. And we took part and to give the history of one survivor, Edith Bader de Vries, a very important part in this theater play. And her sentence, her message on current humanitarian issues is, I'm not here to hate, I'm here to love. This is the title of her biography based on the sentence of From Greek Drama Antigone by Sophocles. Edith's message for today's challenges is, please take care of people in need and in helpless situations like refugees, homeless people. And this was important for us to transform her message with methods of theater to the new generations today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Adelaide, for this fascinating report. I quickly want to move on to the last speaker in this panel, Dr. Muli Brug, is PhD in sociology. His research focuses on issues of collective memory and cultural interpretation of sacred places. So the microphone is yours, Muli. Remember, you have 7 minutes.
My topic dealing with a very sensitive issue and may cause people to feel uncomfortable, so I apologize in advance. I thanks Rony for being my commander-in-chief on the slides. In January 1970, the Knesset approved the Israeli Defense Forces decoration law. The choice of the yellow color to mark the IDF highest decoration for heroism, which you can see on the right-hand side of the slide, was, and I quote, a counterbalance to the attempt to humiliate Jews by this color since the 7th century, and in accordance with Herzl's suggestion that the Jewish award for heroism should be marked in yellow. During the first 40 years of the State of Israel, Holocaust memory in the IDF focused on commander-led discussions and sporadic ceremonies on Holocaust Memorial Day. This was all profoundly changed between the early 1990s in the aftermath of the first Intifada and 2004, the end of the second one. I would argue that by linking the Holocaust atrocity in Europe to the Israeli-Arab conflict, the IDF has done 3 things. A, helped framing the national military clash as a religious one. B, supported the symbolic image of the Palestinians as though they are an existential threat similar to the Nazis. And C, enable a patriotic discourse in which the fallen soldiers, once perceived the hero as heroes who sacrificed their life in the defense of their country, are now seen as victims who were killed in Kiddush Hashem in a sacred war to secure their promised land. For nearly 50 years, a major part of the IDF efforts has been dedicated to the police-style civil security missions in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and to action against terror organizations living there and in Lebanon. The IDF found itself in an apologetic position vis-a-vis the emergent comparison voiced in public discourse and in the media here and around the world between the IDF harsh action and those of the Nazis' army. By the way, IDF stands for Israeli Defense Forces. In addition, the global socio-economic change of the late 1980s and the optimistic peace atmosphere, which followed the Oslo Accord, contributed to the rapidly growing brain drain from the IDF to the civil business world, a phenomenon which has only intensified since. Today, only 1 of 3 eligible youngsters are actually drafted, and the rate of motivation to serve in combat units has dropped to its lowest point ever, less than 65% of the qualified soldiers. These arguments, enlisted in the struggle with the frustration situation, are taken from the moral values arsenal of society, usually found in its historical narrative, religion, or ideological faith. The IDF started searching for new bases for legitimation, and Holocaust memory was found to be the most effective one. Consciously, the IDF saw a need to publish a special guidance booklet called Inculcating the Holocaust Memory in the IDF, as you can see on the screen. Just note the two orange phrases, what is it all about and what is the goal. Consequently, the IDF saw a need to publish the outcome was of great significance. For instance, every year during the last 2 decades, there were about 100,000 military personnel that took part in educational programs conducted by Yad Vashem and other Holocaust memorial institutions. Or each year, for over 20 years now, the IDF allocates millions of US dollars to run the program of Eidim B'Medim, witnesses in uniform, through which 2,500 to 3,000 high-ranking officers and decorated soldiers, as well as members of the bereaved family, travel together with a survivor guide to Holocaust-related sites in Poland. The rationale was, and I quote, when they get off the plane that brought them back from the death camp, they would understand why they should sign on for a military career. So explained Colonel Elazar Stern, who initiated this program. And he added, I quote, by coming here to Poland, we have added the death camp to our military heritage sites and made the Warsaw Ghetto our legacy. At the end of this rite of passage, the participants become witnesses in uniform, thus embodying human skeletons who survived the horrors, wrapped in uniforms of the strongest army in the Middle East. This dichotomy is a pertinent aspect of the everyday mission executed by the soldiers in the West Bank. 1 minute, they are powerful, in control, and the next one, they are too weak to carry out their missions. Their sense of identity with the fate of the Holocaust victims provides an operational advantage for them, in that their sense of victimization could serve as a kind of a moral bulletproof vest in the harsh confrontations with the Palestinian population. In moment of crisis, when in difficult moral dilemma, soldiers can metaphorically wear the yellow patch on their chest and become the young child from the ghetto. Thus, any violence act on their part is deemed as a victim's counteraction against the Palestinians' oppressor. To conclude this presentation, I can paraphrase, no, leave it please. I can paraphrase Samuel Johnson's famous quote by suggesting that the Auschwitz has unfortunately become the last refuge of the Israeli patriot. Thank you.
Thank you, Muli, for this thought-provoking presentation, which I'm sure will gather some questions later on. Thus, we conclude the first panel, and I pass it on to you, Professor Phyllis Lasner, who is a professor emerita at Northwestern University. She's published many books on Holocaust literature and film and women writers. And she will moderate the second panel, which is titled Post-Trauma in Literature, Art and Representation.
Thank you very much. Hello, good afternoon and good evening to everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here. In the interest of time, because the full biographies are given on the website, I'm just going to briefly introduce each of our speakers, all of whom are very distinguished, well and widely published. And it's such a pleasure to have them here. Our first speaker today is Sarah Horowitz. Sarah, are you here?
I am indeed, Phyllis.
Oh, hi, Sarah.
Hi,
Sarah Horowitz is professor of comparative literature and humanities and former director of the Center for Jewish Studies at York University in Toronto. She had her earliest publication, Voicing the Void, has become a classic in Holocaust studies, and I dare say that all of us who have followed in her footsteps rely enormously on that work. She has continued to publish and to also serve as not only president of the Association for Jewish Studies, but that she occupies a wonderfully influential position on the Academic Advisory Committee of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. Her talk today is titled Zadie in the Archives.
Thanks so much, Phyllis. It's so good to see your face. It's so good to see all your faces and hear these thoughtful papers. Several years ago, by fluke, I found a photo of my maternal grandfather, my Zadie, in a digital archive. I had spent several hours searching through several digitized collections of documents connected with shtetls in Eastern Europe for a research project. Before logging out on impulse, I tried but failed to find some traces of my own family. Both my maternal and paternal ancestors and their extended families came to New York in the early part of the 20th century, some just before, some just after World War I. They embraced their new lives in the New World and worked hard to Americanize. They rarely told stories of the old country, except for my paternal grandfather, who spun legends of being rescued from the army by a flying horse and a monkey that spoke Yiddish. The few memories they did relate were laced with loathing for the world left behind, a world marked by poverty and fear. Their descendants inherited no nostalgia for that world. We became curious only when there was no one left to ask. I searched the digitized archives for some evidence of family presence in lists of Jewish businesses, births, conscriptions, and so forth, but I couldn't find any trace. Rather than come out empty-handed, I looked for some image of the world of my ancestors. I searched for photos of the town my mother's family came from, Kamenets-Litovsk, located in the present Belarus. And there he was, in a sepia-colored photo in front of the shtetl's wooden synagogue, my Zadie's face. Younger, of course, than I had ever known him, but unmistakable. He was standing in a row of 6 men and a boy, all looking straight ahead into the camera with the seriousness of expression one wore when photography was still a formal occasion. The only man with a shaved face, Zadie sported a jaunty cap and a tie. Why bring this story to this conference with its focus on Holocaust post-memory? My ancestors are not Holocaust survivors, except in some attenuated understanding that in choosing to immigrate well before the rise of Nazism, they escaped murder. Soon after the photograph was taken, my grandfather departed for New York with his young bride. Their siblings soon followed. That photograph, and indeed our familial memory more broadly, has a different emotional charge and different dynamics than family photos and stories of Holocaust survivors and victims. Using the serendipity of the archival photo as a starting point, I propose to consider different paradigms for relating to the chronotype, that is the space-time of familial memory, as a basis to interrogate the models of post-memory and the post-memorial. How do descendants write their family stories? How do they just inscribe themselves into it? Does Holocaust memory remain a distinct thread, or does it morph down the generations? And if so, how? Susan Sontag once wrote, "All photographs are memento mori, reminders of our mortality." Quote, "Precisely by slicing out this moment and freezing it, all photographs testify to time's relentless melt." Because of this melting away of time, the photo I came upon tells of a place and a time inaccessible to me. But if Sontag zeroes in on the way photographs call up our mortality and all that is lost, it is also true that photos can call the past to life inside of us, at least some version of the past. Theorizing the narrative connections between time and space that he terms chronotype, Mikhail Bakhtin explores what happens when we tell stories grounded in a particular place at a particular time. He muses, time takes on flesh and becomes visible for human contemplation. Space becomes charged and responsive to the movements of time and history and the enduring character of a people. Chronotypes thus stand, he continues, as monuments to the community itself, as symbols of it, as forces operating to shape its members' images of themselves. Inherent in Bakhtin's conception of chronotypes is the connection among space, time, identity, and memory. What I desired from the photograph that I found was some entry into a past that had so rapidly receded, the daily lives of my ancestors, the world of the shtetl encountering modernity. What was Zadie thinking as he posed for the photographer? Was this his everyday garb? Did he deliberately style himself as different from the other men? Why in front of the synagogue? Like so many recovered photographs, this one inspired narratives, however tentative and conjectural. It is in the nature of such photographs to suggest the possible retrieval of unrecounted memories that nonetheless lodge in the hearts of those who come after, something akin to post-memory. And here's where things get productively messy. I sent the photo around to my siblings and my cousins. When they wrote back to me, each of them read themselves into this image of our Zadie in his youth, as I did. Depending on how we defined ourselves, we each saw in the photo a different man, a Jew who would keep his religious traditions in the New World, a rebel who would redefine himself as an American, an adventurer, a modernizer, a man of great intuition, great daring, or great faith. In other words, we saw ourselves as present already in his past, generating narratives to interpret the photo, narratives that wove together space, time, identity, memory, and imagination. How does this connect to the themes of the conference? My grandfather's photo and the narrative interpretations that it generated reminded me of the rich and provocative way that Lori Lefkowitz captured the complicated relationship of children of survivors to their parents' stories as a kind of ventriloquism. As I read Lefkowitz, she describes a dynamic whereby the role of ventriloquist and dummy, if you will, keeps shifting. Parental memories put words in the mouths of their children. And in recounting these stories, children put words in the mouth of their parents. The impressive and growing body of work about the Shoah across disciplines and genres gives irrefutable evidence that one can, of course, write about the Shoah out of personal experience, transmitted knowledge, or research. As Sontag and Bakhtin and others suggest, however, something about narrating the past is always incomplete, unwritten. The past melts away from us, and we cannot seize its stories except through prisms born of our own inner spaces. And how much more so for narratives about the Shoah, laced with bereavement, absence, violence, and trauma. As Maurice Blanchot succinctly put it, the disaster describes. One tells the stories one can bear to tell in ways one can bear to tell them, called upon to call their parents and now grandparents and great-grandparents' stories rather than their own, second, third, fourth generation speakers, recraft the past through their own interpretive lenses, just as the past infuses the present infuses the past. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah, for a great, insightful, and sensitive talk, as always. Our next speaker is Victoria Ahrens, who holds the position of the O.R. and Eva Mitchell Distinguished Professor of Literature at Trinity University in San Antonio, Texas. Among many publications, books, and articles, her most recent work is the monograph Holocaust Graphic Narratives, Generation, Trauma, and Memory. And I'm so delighted to say Dr. Ahrens and I together co-edited the collection, the Palgrave Handbook of Holocaust Literature and Culture. Dr. Ahrens' talk is titled The Intergenerational Transfer of Memory and Trauma in Holocaust Graphic Narratives.
Thank you, Phyllis, and hello, everybody. The 21st century has seen a burgeoning of graphic narratives that give voice to the extended trauma of the Holocaust. With memory as the controlling trope, these graphic artists, through the juxtaposition and intersections of text and image, extend the narrative of the Holocaust into the present, creating a visual testimony to the past, to devastating loss, as well as to survival. As comics theorist Hilary Schutz suggests, the non-fictional graphic narrative that reimagines historical moments of traumatic rupture is a form of witnessing, and as such, an architecture for the expression of individual and collective trauma. In graphic narratives, the manifestation of the image, the material presence of the image, evokes its absence, all the while constructing a material because visual connection to the past. I am primarily interested in those graphic novels, those Holocaust graphic novels, that in reconstructing the events of the Nazi genocide, focus on individual familial experiences as a metonymic expression of collective suffering, and that blur both time and space in an attempt to recreate and reimagine the events that have shaped the landscape of a post-Holocaust world for subsequent generations. There are three examples I want to discuss very briefly here. Miriam Caton's child survivor graphic memoir, We Are on Our Own, Martin Lemmelman's second generation account of his mother's survival in hiding, Mendel's Daughter, and Amy Kurzweil's third generation narrative, Flying Couch. In conversation with each other, these texts represent a multi-generational illocutionary braiding, a multi-voiced response to the Holocaust as it extends in both recollected and imagined memory over time. These narratives go back in time as a conceit for the enactment of memory, and also as a means of laying the groundwork for self-assessment, historical reckoning, and a measure of the continuing legacy of the Holocaust and our mediated responses to it. Through temporal and locational shifts and the dialogic arrangement and intersection of text and image, these graphic narratives create the uneasy condition that exists, as Amy Kurzweil's autobiographical narrator puts it, between all we've lost and what we can't get rid of. We find in these narratives overlapping and intersecting narrating voices whose stories are conveyed through the fractured and indistinct lens of time and traumatic memory. The chorus of voices creates the uneasy conditions among that which is seen and unseen, visible and invisible, present and absent. The medium of graphic narratives performs the tensions, the gaps, and the mediating intercessions that reflect the complicated ways in which memory travels through time and space, reflecting the myriad and labyrinthine ways in which the traumatic memory of the Shoah is transferred through generations. Holocaust graphic narratives provide a unique space for the exploration and expression of traumatic rupture through the wide range of modes of visualizing trauma. The intersection and disjunction in temporality and location, both a moving back and forth and a simultaneity in time and place, as established through the arrangement and juxtaposition of image and text, create the destabilizing conditions for the continuing and unresolved after effects of the traumatic imprint of the Shoah, after effects that invite further description, interpretation, and the response of ethical testimony. Such a hybridity of voices and structures amplifies its subjects by penetrating, by making visible moments of traumatic experience. These richly figured works of art and narration make the past present in the immediacy and proximity of the visual, material recall of inherited memory. Miriam Caton's graphic memoir, We Are On Our Own, published in 2006, is the story of her experience as a child in Hungary during the Nazi invasion. The narrative is told from two competing and often conflicting perspectives, the limited vantage point of a young child survivor and that of her mother, whose memories are mediated through her daughter's illustrated articulation of them. We Are On Our Own, through the interplay of text and image, mediates these differing layered perspectives. The images that Caton draws make emphatic the blurring of perspectives, but also the limitations of memory. The images that represent the past are indistinct, as they are when they represent a danger that Caton can only remember in her projected hold on such remote memory. The illustrations are sketchily drawn, as if the artist is hesitant to commit to a memory that she can't quite distill, but also one that evokes the shape of fear and the difficulty in articulating the peril that exists just beyond language or understanding. In Mendel's Daughter, also published in 2006, Martin Lemmelmann's second-generation graphic depiction of his mother's experiences in hiding during the Nazi occupation of Poland, the unrepresentable casts a haunting shadow over the artist's efforts to bring back to life on the page the members of his extended family unknown to him, but those at the center of his mother's narrative, his mother's loss, a loss that he shares. Amy Kurzweil's third-generation graphic memoir, Flying Couch, published in 2016, is an attempt, as she puts it, to construct a bridge between the real and the unimaginable. Flying Couch presents in comics form the story of Kurzweil's grandmother, who as an adolescent escaped from the Warsaw Ghetto and spent the war in hiding in the Polish countryside. And thus her life was fortuitously spared, while the lives of her grandmother, her parents, and her siblings were lost. Kurzweil's purpose is, in Deuteronomic tradition, to memorialize her grandmother's history, to write and illustrate her life, her history, immortalize it, fashion it into those stories to be imprinted upon our homes and on our gates as we lie down and as we rise up. As Kurzweil makes clear, the story of the Holocaust is ongoing, transferred to subsequent generations by the necessity to keep alive the memory of those who perished and those who survived. The past exists, of course, in her grandmother's memories, but also in the traumatic imprint of a past subsumed in the life of the survivor's granddaughter, who grew up under the shadow of that haunting past. As a genre of witnessing, then, Holocaust graphic narratives, in retracing the traumatic tracks of memory, inscribe the weight of history on generations that follow. As the second-generation memoirist is cautioned by the imagined voice of his mother in Lemmelmann's Mendel's Daughter, sometimes your memories are not your own. Instead, as we find in these intergenerational modes of witnessing, they become part of the accumulation of another person's sorrow, of collective and ongoing mourning. Thank you.
Thank you, Vicki. That was great, as always. And our next speaker, who I'll introduce, is Urga Heller. Urga Heller is a senior lecturer at K Academic College of Education in Beersheba, Israel. She is the head of the Hebrew Literature and Children's Literature Department and the editor-in-chief of Lexi K, a peer-reviewed journal of education and teachers' education.
This talk focuses on illustration of contemporary Israeli picture books about the Holocaust. About 30 picture books about the Holocaust were printed in Israel from the beginning of the 21st century. Most of them are welcomed by Israeli Ministry of Education. 3 of them are autobiographies which are illustrated by their authors. In the newest Israeli picture books about the Shoah, we often find fantastic characteristics that are known as reducers of horror level. According to Adrian Kerzer, Shoah children's books illustration are needed to be recognized as historical. Before studying the historical photographs within the books, first let us look at the dominant color of the contemporary Israeli books, the color of the Shoah, yellow, of course. In Chika, the Dog in the Ghetto by Batsheva Dagan, the illustrator Avi Katz creates a yellowish atmosphere which adds notion of fear and unsecure, although he depicts the yellow star only once. On Mikash, the hero on Mikash's father's coat. In Chava Nisimov and Kinneret Gilder's Kaleidoscope, and in Iris Argaman and Avi Ofer's Bear and Fred, yellow is used to imply to 2 different worlds. The first is a Jewish world, and the second is a fantastic realm of games and toys. In Tamar Meir and Yael Albert's Francesco Tirelli's Ice Cream Shop, as well as in Nava Semel and Gilad Seliktar, Our Candles, yellow is used to depict light and hope for better days, using Sabbath candles and a Chanukiah, in the same way that Avi Katz uses it in the gun Chika, the Dog in the Ghetto. The ambivalent nature of yellowish light is based both on cultural and historical knowledge. Some of the illustrators imply to other cultural traditions, as we can see here, camouflaging items as camp uniforms and the yellow star in a general artistic homage. The use of camp uniform is bringing us back to the question of photographs and other historical documentation. In contemporary Israeli picture books on the Holocaust, usually historical photographs are not used. Here, in Alona Frankel's self-illustration for Lama leNaftali Korim Naftali, and in English, Why Joshua is Called Joshua, the dark past is organized in a photo album. The photo album keeps the unwanted memories away from the colorful world of Naftali, Joshua, who Steve, as the young readers may see, only smiling faces in the album. Unlike Frankel, in Ariela Calvaria Friedman and Maria Givner's There Was a Palace, the illustrations are changed or faked. Eden Friedman, the author's daughter and the heroine granddaughter, remarks in a television interview that the visual adaptation tries to show the colorful world of the Shoah survivors, since they did not see the world in black and white. A similar conception of free copying objects instead of presenting them is found in another autobiographical picture book, Grandpa's Third Drawer by Judy Tal Koppelman. But Tal Koppelman uses darkened compositions to present the Holocaust. Back to Alona Frankel. Here we see a another technique of showing monstrous past without letting the irritating historical artifacts in. Frenkel simply uses the basic art language, pop lines, dark colors. She distinguishes like that between the past and the colorful present. Here, in Kinneret Gilder's illustration, we see little Eva, the heroine called Eva. She's holding a doll and she is suffering from a nightmare. Eva shrinks in fear in the corner of her bed. Her darkened bedroom is enclosing on her in a rounded shape with no escape. Here, in A Hug of Love, by Gila Matzliach Lieberman and a most known Israeli illustrator, Danny Kerman, Kerman makes an homage to the past by assembling modern illustrating technique side by side with an older one, woodcut. He presents the past events as darkened, unfocused, generic, and unpersonal. But black is the color of the past. Unlike yellow, it does not imply any possibility of hope, light. Perhaps this is why yellowish light is an internal part of the Israeli Shoah literature for young readers. The monstrous Nazi soldiers are not part of any Israeli picture book. They are taken out of a German animation film, an adaptation for Batsheva Dagan's Chica the Dog in the Ghetto. These soldiers appear in Little Mikash, Nightmare. Yes, they are terribly irritating. Do Israeli illustrators let the monsters in, as we can see here? No, not in picture books.
Okay, thank you, Erga, for a very illuminating talk. And we will move on now to our next speaker, Nitza Dori, who is head of the Department of Early Childhood and the Shannon Academic College in Haifa. She is a researcher of Hebrew literature, children's literature, and Ladino literature, and the author of children's books. Welcome, Nitza.
Thank you very much. Good evening. I want to introduce you the toys found in 5 Hebrew books as exhibits for transmitting the legacy of the Shoah, as visual symbols that are also social cultural objects, as a means of survival for children during the Shoah period, and as relators of narrative that is passed from one generation to the next. Children's books occupy a central position in the socialization process, and their potential influence on young children when age limits their decoding and ideological opposition abilities requires discussion. During the Shoah period, the toys were a kind of transition object that helped children overcome situations of separation from a familiar family member. In the cruel atmosphere of the Shoah, toys and games continue to exist even after other culture behaviors and consumer objects had already disappeared. The children during the Holocaust period spent their entire day in the ghetto in terrible conditions, some alone and some with their siblings and families. And to make them feel better, their parents tried to bring their children various toys that they made for them, or the children themselves would make or invent various socio-dramatic games to make the time pass pleasantly and keep quiet in the ghetto or their hideouts so the Nazis would not find them. And to relieve their fears, the most common toy or game during the Shoah period was the doll or teddy bear, usually made out of wood, paper, fabric, or wool. The story Adubi Shel Fred, Bear and Fred, a World War II story by Iris Argaman, tells us that during the Second World War, Fred's parents in Holland had to hide him with different families. Fred took with him his little bear and blankie created by his parents, who sewed for him from various materials, and which was his source of comfort and outlet for missing his family. The transition of Fred's bear from Europe to America and from there to Jerusalem leave traces of his existence in every move and settling in from one place to another. And in each place, he must adapt to new adoptive parents. In the story, Grandpa's Third Drawer, Unlocking Holocaust Memories, written and illustrated by Judith Tal Koppelman, we become aware of the fact that the grandparents are Shoah survivors, but what they believe to be their terrible secret is hidden from the child, since they want to give him a warm, loving home that is pleasant to come back to, and not a house full of horrific things and trauma. After the third drawer is open, Grandpa Yuda allows Uri to touch the doll that belonged to Anna, his little sister, who was killed in the Shoah. For Uri, the grandson, touching the doll is touching his grandfather's past and the depths of his suffering and sorrow, and this makes him partner in the experiences of the past. In the story Buba Me'eretz Acheret, a doll from another country, by Ofra Galbert Avni, Noga's preschool teacher asked the children to bring toy they love from home. Every child brings a modern toy, a teddy bear, a robot, Barbie doll, a radio-controlled Jeep, but Noga brings an ugly, raggedy doll. All the children make fun of Noga because of the doll she brought, and Noga gets insulted and cries because of their behavior. During circle time, Noga explains that this was grandmother Esther's doll when she was little. The story Kaleidoscope by Chava Nisimov is based on the true story of the life of Nisimov, who was called Eva as a child and also in the story, who was given a kaleidoscope for her 5th birthday by her cousin Adam during the Shoah period. The object that should have brought Eva light and warmth, concentrating the broken sun's rays inside it, is left at home, and now Eva is exposed to a miserable cold reality outside. In the book Asodot Shel Savta, Grandma's Secrets, the grandson asks many questions about the Shoah period of his grandmother. The grandmother does not laugh or make fun of her grandson for his naive questions. She understands his viewpoint. The wooden horse who tells Grandma Gronias is an empathic narrator aware of his audience of receivers. He explains what needs explaining. He patiently answers every question he is asked. The books that were discussed tell the first-hand story of children and their toys, Shoah survivors who wanted to continue living despite everything, and describe their attempts to create themselves a different reality from that surrounding them. Thank you.
Thank you, Nitsa. Our next speaker is Naama Reshoff, who is a lecturer in literature and education at the K Academic College of Education and the editor-in-chief of the academic journal Kolot. She is currently researching the concepts of identity and memory in Holocaust literature. The title of her talk today is From Silent Memory to Emotional Memory, in Nava Semmel's book, And the Rat Laughed.
Nava Semmel was one of the first to write about the influence of the silent memories of the Holocaust survivors on the members of the second and third generation. She wrote several books about it. In her book, And the Rat Laughed, published in 2001, Semmel indicates the inability of the integrative narrative memory to bury the remembrance and replace the silence. An old woman, as she's called throughout the book, tries to tell her granddaughter of her traumatic experiences during the Holocaust. She tries to tell her story to pass on her memory, but she can't lay her memory bare in the form of a coherent narrative, only conveying hazy fragments, a shell of the story, as she calls it. A girl, father, mother, pit, darkness, a rat, and a figure called Stefan. She finds it impossible to condense the original traumatic experience that transcends the bounds of imagination and understanding into a template of words, into the recognized language and accepted representation. The narrative story fails, and it seems as if the memory has been buried forever. But Semel doesn't stop here. She's offering an alternative to the narrative memory. When the fragmented traumatic story transforms into a fictional work of art, a tale, a poem, a myth, as they appear in the various chapters of Semel's book, something happens to the recipient. Even into the future, almost 200 years after the horrific events took place, they feel something of the original trauma. They connect to the heart of the trauma, the darkness, which the old lady tried in vain to explain in words. They remember something. Their encounter with the darkness is accompanied by an uncanny feeling. It's foreign, frightening, and discomforting, but at the same time, familiar, almost homely. It isn't mine, said one character, and suddenly it is. Semel depicts 4 women at 4 different points in time, and a darkness that connects them to one traumatic story. These are 4 points on, as Semel terms it, the relay race of remembrance, all without the lucid, factual narrative story being told even once to one of those who remember it. So how do they remember? She'd gotten used to not being able to remember the words, Semel writes of the old woman. Darkness was what she could feel. End of quote. Against the silent narrative memory, Semel posits the emotional memory, a memory located beyond the events and facts themselves. The emotional memory preserves an emotional extract of the original trauma, passing under the threshold of the consciousness of the sender and recipient, in whom it beats as a living heartbeat. Semel signals the aesthetic fictional realm as one that enables the transfer of the emotional memory. When a silent memory is processed into a fictional story, poem, myth, or other fictional work, it succeeds in making its presence felt as an emotional memory. How does it happen? In Semel's book, the emotion attached to the traumatic experience is not purely a conscious entity. Emotion possesses a physical essence that is engraved into the body, is branded into the flesh. It sticks between the teeth, between the legs. It blazes visually on the flesh like a tattoo. It pervades the blood, every cell and neuron. For those bearing a memory, it is always accompanied by strong physical sensations, such as nausea and vomiting. The psychoanalyst and literary scholar Julia Kristeva identifies the bodily sensory dimension as belonging to a pre-verbal semiotic realm in which the child experiences the bond with its mother via raw sensory impressions, bodily compulsions, sensual feelings, rhythm, and tone. The semiotic physical sensory realm is not identified by formal, organized, and symbolic language, is not subject to its rules, and cannot be expressed by it. The vivid physical emotional impressions at the heart of the traumatic experience belong to this pre-verbal semiotic realm that precludes them from being coherently formulated via the organized grammatical and linguistic structures of symbolic language. Pre-verbal semiotic communication does not disappear when a child begins to communicate via symbolic language, but rather takes a backseat, retreats to the unconscious. In order to reveal the semiotic behind the symbolic and to give voice to the physical emotional impression, we must use language in a way that will dismantle the organized, arranged, and disciplinary structures of the symbolic language. Poetic language, used in the act of art, as Semel terms it, achieves this in several different ways, which I will briefly illustrate via the lyric fragments in the 3rd chapter of Semel's book. The corpus of poem in this chapter contain violent and harsh texts, whose origin is unknown. They are home to the characters from the old woman's fragmented story: a girl, father, mother, a rat, and Stefan. The poetic language uses an entire poetic lexicon to resist the symbolic language, the very words and sentences in which it is itself composed, thereby exposing the semiotic realm. For example, ideas from one semantic field are used to describe experiences and feelings from an entirely different one, driving a wedge between markers and the indicated terms. Like in the poem called Warm, I'll never be cold, for dirt is my blanket. I'll always be warm, for I'll cover with blood. The expectation created by the use of markers that are familiar to us from the semantic field of warmth and safety is shattered in the face of the unusual pairing with dirt and blood taken from the semantic fields of death and war. There is also a transgressive gap between the poem linguistic register, childish, naive, and innocent tones, and their shocking and sinister content that does not allow us to accept them at face value. For example, in the poem, green is what comes out of your mouth, red is what comes out of your legs, brown is what comes out from behind, black is light. Another way in which poetic language enables the semiotic to penetrate the symbolic is by exposing the language materialistic and formative aspects and the game in which it engages with them. Example of this includes the use of oxymorons, contrasts, metaphors, and metonymies, such as black is light, my body makes rain, and a whole child is running out of steam. The text also features numerous repetitions that emphasizes the symbolic language artificiality, such as in the poem A Riddle. Where's the little girl? What little girl? Was there ever a little girl? The compressed repetitiveness also sustains rhythm and musicality, which are some of the signs of the semiotic realm. Semmel also uses different allusions to children's songs, stories, and games she embeds in the poem in a way that flips their original meanings, presenting them in a threatening and disturbing light. The poem Lullaby, for example, opened with words from a magical legend. Once upon a time, there was a little Jewish girl, and she had little Jewish hands, but is quickly twisted into a nightmarish poem, and a little Jewish body, and a big hole. The poem Catch seemingly describes the familiar game, but its content reveals a horrific reality. If I run away, he gets even more wild. That's the game that we play. That's the fun to child. The refusal to be written within the framework of the accepted marking convention instill the poetic language with an element of subversion and position it as a liminal language, which undermines and cracks the boundaries of symbolic language, thereby exposing the semiotic realm in which the emotional memory is seared, given the trauma avoided. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll move on now to our last speaker, Oshri Bar-Gil, who is a PhD candidate at the Psychoanalysis, Culture, and Hermeneutics postgraduate program at Bar-Ilan. The title of his talk today is Never Forget, the Net Will Remember.
Hi, and welcome to the lecture. I hope you hear me well. I'm Oshri, I'm a PhD candidate here at the Bar-Ilan University from the program of Cultural Studies, Hermeneutic, and Psychoanalysis. Let me start by apologizing for my English. Let me continue by saying that my PhD dissertation deals with the way technology changes our self-concept, the way we think about ourselves. But today, for this lecture, it intersects with a personal story, not only how the internet connections is mediating our memory of the Holocaust, but the way it mediates me and my family memory of our grandmother, Savta Hana. So let's start. The Holocaust memory and Holocaust studies have always been intertwined. And in the field of memory studies, there is the concept of post-memory. In the other fields, recently, Andrew Hoskins employs the concept of connective memory as a way to sensitize ourselves and highlighting the influence of digital connections in memory patterns and their nature of being immediate, mobile, flexible, and interactive. This new emergent memory is a result of digital hyperconnectivity and is particularly pronounced in social networks, file sharing systems, and other sites and databases. Also in the fields of Shoah or Holocaust studies in general and Holocaust database in general. For the starting point of the story, let me start with what we call in Yiddish and what my grandmother used to say, etzetele, in the sense that's the way she used to call those kinds of notes. We found this note in one of my grandmother's notebooks. We're not truly sure when or why she wrote it. Maybe she tried to train her biological memory. We're not so certain about it. But nowadays, it's a material memory for us and in the sense of memory studies. But her material memory allowed us a journey that we took and was navigated with the aid of the internet. It allows each and every member of the family to try and hang with the experience differently. When we saw and read all those kinds of tzetalach, which is note, but in plural sense, a different experience that wasn't available without the internet. We weren't able to find the Epstein Gymnasium, which you see here, and she mentioned in one of their notes, and feel like, okay, we know, we have seen this place, it changes the way we think about her. The past always looks alien from the perspective of the present. It is transformed through decay, forgetting, misremembering, reprisal, and through all the things that we look through the lens of today. We see of her today, but we don't really know what is the ship that she came with. And through the use of large databases, we were able to find the ship, this Campdagio ship, that she came with it to Israel. All kinds of memory guesswork have to be made. This is what we call the pay-ed, like a testimony files. Once they're indexed, we were able to find out that she testified twice. We're not really sure, and she have done it in 20 years time, but our perception of time in the digital memory is not linear, is broken. We see them in this page of Yad Vashem simultaneously. It's interesting to note that the names and the details are almost identical in those testimonies. And we, the humans, had to fix the database memory of her testimonies because it doesn't really know. It's not so smart as we sometimes think. Sometimes the memory takes the form of multiple databases connected together, big data, as sometimes it's referred to. I would argue that collecting those memories and connecting them together more than connecting them apart is one of the older generation's job, but the next generation job will be to connect them better, to make the connective memory much stronger and more linked. Linking and indexing is not you. Well, this is, it's called Sefer Kehilot of Her Keilah. Was written actually in 1973. Most of our older generations in the family skipped about it, although they were curious about our story as much as we do. And our family learned about the story only in 2018, too late for us. But it's not only about being digital, and it's not only about being safe on the net. It's about free access and search engine optimization. This digital also reveals some alien and unpredictable memories, but it also transcends the time of now and then. We're not really sure if it's her memory of the or the memory that were written about her. It's a different type of connection. As Lawrence Scott used to say, it takes all dimensions apart. To keep the critical note about technology and memory in part, I must say that relying on tech to mediate memory for us might have a downside. I guess most of you are familiar with the debate about coloring some Holocaust images. While it is a great Okay, so I don't really know where I left you, so I just said that I will always cherish my unmediated memories with my Savta Hana, and will try and searching for new ones. And I think me and my generation will have them, but the next generation will have no choice. It will have to rely more and more about mediated memories and other kinds of connected memories. This is only one family story, and it's a family story. I'm not alone in these issues. Another aspect of the connected memory is that every member of the family has done his share, and we were able to gather this puzzle together. But I think it's the story of memory of about the memory of the Holocaust in the third decade of the 21st century to become more and more mediated by the network and to be remembered by connective memory agents that mediate, modulate, and moderate this memory to us, the humans. So the next generation and our generation have to make a new connections. Some of them will be available by achievements in technology, and new database will be digitized and connected. Other immersive technologies such as virtual reality or coloring images might help others to experience the memory better. But what will be the quality of the memory is up to us. So let me hang to the bibliography if someone wants. And I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Oshri, and thank you, Phyllis, for moderating this panel. We are running late, but we now have Professor Judy Baumel-Schwartz, my co-host, whose name goes ahead of her. She's a professor of many places. So, Judy, I welcome you to give your contribution.
Okay, thank you very much. We are only 30 minutes late, and it says on the program that I have 15 minutes to speak, and guess what? I will not do that to you. And therefore, we're going to just cut all my visual presentation. I'll show you one picture at the end, and let's start. We are talking about post-memory. What is post-memory? We've been talking about it now for 2 hours, but let's give a really good definition. It's not your memory, but now it is. And that's like how a study becomes a source. That's what we're dealing with here. It was somebody else's memory. Today it's ours. The topic that we're talking about, writing the unwritable. Most of our participants spoke about written memory, performative memory like games and toys, educational memory, memory as a result of studies. I'm going to talk about a very different memory. I'm going to talk about something that combines all of the above that I call final post-memory. Now, what could be more final than tombstones? And that's what I'm going to talk about. I'm doing it on the most personal level with a personal story, a personal memory, and then I'm going to branch out and see how it relates to all of us. Background. This is about me, or it's actually about my family. My father was a Holocaust survivor, what we call 1G, first generation. He lost a wife, parents, and a sister in the Holocaust. My mother was American born. She was 3G, third generation. She lost grandparents, aunts, cousins in the Holocaust. My grandmother used to say to me, gee, you and I are both second generation, which is interesting, but also true. Now a little bit of what we call death chronology. My father passed away in 1993. Throughout his lifetime, he never talked about what he wanted on his tombstone. And actually, tombstone was not really a topic in our family because none of his family who had, I can't say perished, murdered, none of his family who were murdered during the Holocaust had tombstones. So that was something really new. He never talked about what he wanted mentioned, if there would be anything. He left it all up to us. So there I am standing in front of an empty grave and I'm saying, so what am I going to put on his tombstone? Believe it or not, here I am, Holocaust scholar. It never occurred to me to even think of putting on his tombstone the fact that he was a survivor. He was a man who lived in the present. He was a man who always looked towards the future. Right after the war, he created a post-war kibbutz that he brought to Israel. I certainly knew he was a Holocaust survivor. When I thought how to define him, that wasn't what I thought about. However, I did know that I had on his side grandparents and an aunt and what I call my stepmother, in other words, my half-brother and sister's mother, who were killed during the Holocaust. We wanted to memorialize them, we meaning my half-brother and sister and I. So what we ended up doing was having a standing stone for my father. And in Israel, you have a lying down stone very often. So on the lying down stone, we had something very short, that a small text that said in memory of his parents with their name, his sister with her name, and his first wife with her name, who were murdered during the Holocaust. End of story. Now, let's take it to the other side. My mother's chronology, a very different story. She always talked about what she wanted on her tombstone. She kept telling me that she had make sure that I would put her parents, meaning her grandparents, my great-grandparents, and her two aunts, one who was killed in Babi Yar in Russia, the other one who died in Transnistria, also was murdered. They should be memorialized on her tombstone. Interesting, her grandparents did have tombstones. They were buried, but nobody knows where their graves are today. And therefore, when they went back to look for them in Transnistria, as if they don't exist. My mother died in 2014. In fact, today is 7 years, the English date of her death, if we're already talking about coincidences. And I made a short inscription on her lying down stone, again, in memory of her grandparents, in memory, et cetera, et cetera. Now, what is post-memory? Not our memories, somebody else's memories that we turn into memories that we put on a stone. But that's only the middle of the story. Now begins the transformation. At some point in the past 7 years, I sat down to write a book. I wrote a book about my mother. And doing so, I had the privilege of thousands of pages of correspondence between my mother and me. I saved every note, every page, every letter that she sent to me from the day we moved to Israel 47 years ago. I used to joke and say, one day when you're gone, this is what I'm going to have. When I was going through the papers, all of a sudden I found a letter that she had written me 30 years ago, in which she wrote, on my tombstone, remember to put my grandparents, my aunts, so far so good, and now comes the bad part, and the years they died, the places they were killed. Oops, bad. Talk about the shoemaker's children going barefoot. I had forgotten that part. So there is a Hebrew concept called tikkun, fixing something. When did I fix it? A year and a half ago, I celebrated my 60th birthday. Now, you know the quandary. What are we going to get mommy for her birthday? And my husband, what am I going to get Judy for my birthday? So I made life easier for everyone. I said, guess what I want for my birthday? I want a tombstone. What? I said, no, not mine. Don't worry. I want to redo my parents' tombstones. I felt that my mother had given me a list of what she wanted. I hadn't carried it out. And if we already have share screen, as I talk, let's see if it works. I had prepared it. Am I sharing? Not yet. Hold on. Let me see if I can do this. So lo and behold, here we go. Can you see? Wait, let's see. Is it coming up? Do we see anything? Yes, you should see it now. Okay, this was my father's original lying down short memorial. And here you can see this long Megillah that we wrote, in which I made sure that every person, who their parents were, where they were buried, where they weren't buried, what they went through in the war. My mother's original stone in the memory of her grandfather, her grandmother, her aunt. I didn't even know her aunt who was killed in Babi-Yar. I didn't even know her married name. I used my grandfather's name because I didn't know anything else. But when I wrote the book, I found documentation. And as you can see, we have the entire thing. What I did add at the bottom is the Hebrew expression, Hashem yikom damam. May the Lord avenge their memories, their blood. Now, let's stop screen sharing. Hold on a second. Stop share. And let's get to the end of the story. Why did I do all of this? I've got to tell you, a tombstone is not cheap. And to do two tombstones is even more expensive. Why did I want that for my 60th birthday? Not only because I felt guilt that my mother had asked for something and I didn't do it right. It's like the last thing I could do for her. But it's more than that. I'm a historian. I read tombstones as texts. And as I said, the shoemaker's children, in this case, the shoemaker's parents, go barefoot. This is one's last big post-memorial text. What is going to be on a tombstone? And therefore, I was going to do it right. So what are our conclusions? How are we doing in terms of time? 7 minutes, not bad. Our conclusions: Holocaust tombstone post-memory is the final post-memory. It's also the finite post-memory, if you think about it, because I'm not the only person who does this, who memorializes people from the Holocaust on their parents' tombstone or their tombstone in most cases, but it's going to end because when I think about it, so when my time really does come, we've memorialized everybody. I'm second generation. There's no more. My third generation kids aren't going to have to memorialize people from the Holocaust because they've been memorialized. So this is it. This is the memorial. And many survivors, and I can tell you how many in a second, many survivors try to memorialize their murdered family this way. I know that this is not only in Israel, because I'm in the middle of writing a big article for Phyllis, as you remember, on this topic. And to do so, I actually went to the cemetery under lockdown, don't tell anybody, one rainy day, but who's going to tell on me? There's nobody in the cemetery. And I went through something like 1,500 tombstones just in one section. And I went from row to row and row to row, and I took pictures and I read every single memorial. There were hundreds of them, hundreds and hundreds of people memorialized their family. So guess what, folks? You know what the one thing that we can all do is that when we go to a cemetery for whatever reason, look around and read those memorials. That's the one thing that we can do to remember those people. So finally, I thank everybody here for participating, because this conference in itself is a post-memorial act. And by participating, we have all become part of the process. Thank you all.
Thank you, Judy, for this wonderful delivery. All this material will be available on the website. So any future thoughts, ideas for chapters for a book, which Judy and I are planning on publishing sometime in the near future on the subject of memory, please write to us. And thank you again, all speakers.
May I ask a question?
Of course.
Okay, can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay. My name is Bella Rubin. I'm from Tel Aviv University. I wanted to say hello to Phyllis Lassner.
Hi, Bella.
Who obviously didn't remember me. Okay. I actually don't have a question. I enjoyed listening so much to a lot of most of the speakers. I learned a great deal. But what I wanted to add to what the speaker who spoke about graphic arts, I wanted to know if she's familiar with Michel Kishka's graphic work. He wrote something called Second Generation. It may not have been come out in English yet. It was originally French, but his work is absolutely superb. It takes what, it's worthwhile looking into. I can send a copy to you if you haven't read it. And anyone who's interested in graphic arts has to know who Michel Kishka is. His father was in Auschwitz, and he tells, it's basically an autobiographical work, and it's biographical. And he had 3 siblings. One committed suicide. And after that suicide, his father finally began to talk about his experiences in Auschwitz. So it's something that everyone should look at if you're interested in the graphic type of genre.
Thank you, Bella.
About this. Okay.
It is. It's out in English. I talk about one of the chapters of my book, and it is really, really an interesting work.
He's a fantastic person.
The illustrations are just searing.
Yes, yes. I know him very well. Okay.
Bella, can you write the title of the book in the chat? People asking.
Yeah, it's called Second Generation. I'll write it in. Second Generation. It's easy to remember.
Thank you, Bella.
That's what it was in Hebrew.
Yeah. Yes, Aviva. Yes.
Hi. Thank you for letting me speak. I'm not part of the group, but I just had to say and let you know that life is so strange. It's the first time in my life that I see Oshri Bar-Gil, who is his grandmother Hannah that he was talking about was my father's sister, and it's just found out an entire family last year. And I'm just too emotional about the whole thing. But Oshri, it's a pleasure meeting you.
Another way of connective memory.
It's just
in process, post-memory in process.
Yeah. So thank you for letting me say hello.
So it's been 3.5 hours that we all sat in together, listening to fascinating talks by all of you, and I commend you all for being able to really contain it to 7 minutes each. And obviously there's room for much more. So again, I thank you all. I thank Judy and all the speakers, and follow the website. The videos of the conference will be available there in a couple of days, and we'll be in touch with our emails, and see you next time, hopefully in person. And again, thank you for staying.